had fun talking at Valley TechCon about society and technology. And so I thought it'd be fun to look at some of these slides and also pick Priska's brain about some of the things that she might think about, some of the fables, myths, stories that we looked at. So we talked about Prometheus, and then Jack and the Algorithms / Beanstalk and Frankenstein, and then went straight to Nietzsche. So really, no one was spared in the making of this film. But what I wanted to ask you,
skipped Atlas.
What myths, stories, works of literature, tropes come to mind when you think of the relationship between humans and technology?
Well, just earlier we were talking about how, in the talk you talked about how Prometheus, in some versions, he didn't just bring fire, he also brought like a lot of culture things, like how to make food, how to do agriculture, and I connected that to a very similar myth about Osiris, which I believe is the more common version as opposed to the less common version in that particular case, and he very much is like teaching the humans everything, and then he gets killed. Huh, interesting.
Really?
Fascinating. Yeah, and so he gets killed by Set, Chaos, and then gets brought back by Isis, Fertility, and her sister Nephthys, River. And
this is actually one of the most colorful stories from mythology, and there are a lot of colorful stories in mythology.
Oh yeah, if you ever look it up sometime, it's fascinating. And then Horus, their son, conceived after Osiris was dead in some versions. Like, he comes back, he fights Set, he loses an eye, is gifted it back by wisdom.
Yes.
And Set loses the ability to procreate, which and then Horus becomes like a king, a lawgiver, a god that like is connected to and protects kings, and Osiris becomes a lord of the underworld.
Yes.
So that's...
Tell me how this applies to technology. I think it's fascinating.
I was thinking, the first thing that came to mind is like more specific than it probably should be, but the way that like culture and specifically technology, when it goes up against chaos, loses, and then law needs to be reinstated by the next generation. And it makes me think of the like stories about how the internet is getting too big, and also when cars first started being a thing, a bunch of people died because like there were no road laws, and how we have all these like things that people have access to, and the internet is wonderful and it's so cool, and also there are no regulations yet. We're kind of living in the Wild West right now, and so do we need law to come in and sort everything out with the aid of wisdom?
Okay, so let me see if I'm getting this straight. So you have some sort of cultural or technological advance, but that itself is accompanied by chaos, or there's a chaotic element that enters whenever that technology is implemented. Because very much along with what I'm saying, with what I was saying with these other stories, but then you're saying what happens next is it requires wisdom to incorporate, or it requires the underworld to incorporate successfully. What happens next?
Do you mean about Horus and Set fighting?
In the myth of Osiris, what happens after we encounter this destructive element that comes with the introduction of technology / culture?
I mean, we make a stupid decision and climb in a sarcophagus at a party, and then get sealed in and thrown in the Nile, if we're being literal. But for a time, the culture giver is destroyed.
What I hear there is voluntarily, I don't know how much you want to make of this, but voluntarily, the old version of culture, the father, seals himself up, chooses death, chooses to die. So culture dies.
It's partially an assassination, but yes, culture dies.
It is an assassination, but culture dies and then has to be reconstituted or remembered by some other magical forces.
By the divine feminine, which is interesting because a lot of times in human culture, when the culture is falling apart, we were talking about this earlier, about how oftentimes in times of instability, the only, like, the people who hold the family together is often women.
Oh, you're right.
And like, and then you were talking about how it's interesting because from those societies, most of the successful men that come from there, all their role models were women. And like how that creates an interesting social interplay.
Yeah. Okay, so it makes sense from an archetype perspective because the archetypal feminine, first of all, brings forth life and is mysterious and chaotic. Maybe, and you could say that's because men wrote these stories, and maybe if women wrote the stories, they would say men are mysterious and chaotic, but it is the way it is. And women are mysterious and chaotic. So once the problem of society passes into the chaotic realm, then now it becomes a woman's business to fix it.
Yes. Oh, and I misspoke earlier. I realized Horus was already born by the time Osiris was killed.
In some versions.
In some versions, yeah. And Isis flees with him into hiding. And then Chaos's wife follows and helps reconstitute Osiris.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, in that story, it's also because the two are sisters, because deities be like that, blah, blah, blah.
Right. But there's a closer and less combative relationship between the women representing chaos and culture than there is between the men representing chaos and culture.
Kind of. Okay, go. Do you have any other thoughts, feelings, discussions?
Well, I have lots of thoughts and feelings about Set and Horus.
And women.
I mean, I think the versions of the story where Horus only has one eye, and he gets back the other eye from the god of wisdom, but he gives it to his father to be able to wisely rule the underworld. So he, as now the ruler of the overworld, literally has one of his eyes understanding and gathering wisdom from the world of the living, and one of his eyes understanding and gathering information from the world of the dead. And so those two halves of his world come together and show him how to rule wisely. I think that's amazing.
It's so cool. It's so cool. And
whoever writes these stories should get a raise.
Yeah, I agree. Hoorah.